The world was once only forests, rivers, and stone, everything ending where the land ended. And then, somewhere in deep prehistory, humans kept walking, past the last trees, past the last dry ground, until the earth itself began to dissolve beneath their feet. And for the very first time they saw it. A horizon that did not end. A moving, breathing expanse of water that stretched farther than the mind could measure. No map, no name, no memory prepared them for what stood before their eyes. Before we go deeper into this moment when humanity first met the ocean, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this are where history stops being familiar and starts becoming something else entirely. The world narrows to footsteps and then it stops. For generations, everything a human could know fits inside inland horizons, forests thick enough to swallow sound, river valleys that carve predictable paths through stone and soil, open plains where distance can be measured by the movement of herds and the slow turning of seasons. But at the edge of this familiar world, something begins to change. The land no longer behaves like land is supposed to behave. It does not end, it dissolves. A small group moves forward through terrain that grows increasingly uncertain. The ground softens underfoot, becoming damp in ways that are unfamiliar far from major rivers. The air shifts too, carrying a strange freshness that seems almost metallic, almost alive. It is not the dry clarity of inland winds, nor the earthy scent of forest after rain. It is something else entirely, something that seems to come from a place without trees, without soil, without shelter. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, the group does not yet know what they are approaching. There is no word for it that can survive across tens of thousands of years, no inherited memory that describes what lies ahead. They only follow what has always guided survival movement toward resources, away from scarcity, toward uncertainty only when necessity demands it. But even so, hesitation builds. The trees begin to thin. The forest canopy breaks apart, allowing light to strike the ground in sharper, more exposed patterns. Birds behave differently here, their calls scattered, less coordinated, as if the environment itself disrupts familiar rhythms. Even the soil changes texture, becoming coarse in some places, sticky in others, as though the earth is being slowly rewritten. Then the sound arrives. At first it is mistaken for wind passing through distant valleys, a low, irregular roar that rises and falls without pattern, but as the group advances, the sound refuses to resolve into anything familiar. It is not wind, it is not animals, it is not the crackle of fire or the collapse of stone. It is something continuous, something vast enough to carry its own presence across distance, and still they move forward. What waits ahead is not revealed all at once. The land slopes downward in subtle stages, almost imperceptible at first. Vegetation grows shorter, roots begin to expose themselves like veins pulled from the earth. The ground becomes unstable, shifting beneath weight in ways that inland terrain rarely allows. There is a sense that the world is becoming thinner, as if it is approaching an edge it does not fully understand. Then, without warning, the horizon opens. There is no clear boundary, no wall, no cliff that announces an end. Instead, the world simply stops holding continuity. The trees fall away completely. The ground flattens into wide stretches of sand and rock, and beyond that, where expectation demands more land, there is only movement. A vast shifting surface stretches outward without limit. It is not still. It is not solid. It behaves like nothing encountered before. It rises and falls in slow, relentless pulses, as if the earth itself has begun to breathe in a different form. Light reflects off it in broken patterns, making distance impossible to judge. What appears near is not near. What seems far does not remain fixed. For early humans standing at this threshold, the mind searches desperately for familiar categories: river, lake, marsh, floodplain, anything that could contain what is seen. But none of these are sufficient. Rivers have banks, lakes have edges, even floods eventually retreat. This does none of those things. It continues beyond sight, beyond comprehension. The silence of the group is not peaceful. It is strained. Cognitive boundaries are being tested in real time, where instinct struggles to map meaning onto something without precedent. Some step forward cautiously, then stop again, as if the ground itself might collapse into the moving expanse ahead. The air here behaves differently too. It is heavier with moisture, carrying a constant saltiness that clings to skin and hair. Every breath tastes faintly of mineral and distance, as if the atmosphere has been infused with a memory of something ancient and immeasurable. Inland, air belongs to forests, fires, and soil. Here, it belongs to something that never rests. What lies before them is the ocean, though that word will not exist for a very long time. At first contact, it is not understood as a body of water at all. It is experienced as presence, a force that occupies space without revealing structure. The continuous sound becomes part of awareness itself, impossible to separate from thought. It is as if the world has acquired a new sense, one that operates beyond sight and touch. Some members of the group retreat slightly, their bodies responding before interpretation can form. Others remain fixed, observing the endless motion as though trying to detect patterns that might restore familiarity. In inland environments, everything that moves eventually resolves into cause and effect. Wind moves grass, animals move through grass, rivers move around stone. Here, movement exists without clear origin or end. This is the first true encounter with scale that cannot be reduced to survival logic. And yet, even in this moment of disorientation, curiosity persists. Humans are not only shaped by fear, but by the compulsion to understand. That tension holds them at the edge, preventing complete withdrawal. The unknown does not simply repel, it also draws attention with a force that is difficult to resist. Archaeological evidence from later coastal sites suggests that early human groups did not simply encounter the sea once and retreat. Instead, there is a pattern of repeated return, gradual adaptation, and slow incorporation into subsistence strategies. But in this first moment, none of that exists yet. There is only confrontation with something that refuses to behave like any other part of the known world. Far inland, life is defined by cycles, dry and wet seasons, migration and return, scarcity and abundance. At the edge of this vast expanse, cycles appear to dissolve into something more continuous, less predictable. Even the horizon seems unstable, constantly shifting its boundary with the sky. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. To see something that extends without visible end is to confront a form of infinity that the mind is not prepared to process. It forces a reorganization of perception itself. Distance loses certainty. Direction becomes less reliable. Even time begins to feel altered, as if the presence of such magnitude slows internal rhythm. Some early groups likely turned away at this point, retreating to safer terrain. Others remained longer, attempting to decode the movement, the sound, the endless variation in surface patterns. In doing so, they unknowingly stepped into one of the most important transitions in human history. Because what they are seeing is not just water. It is a boundary that will reshape migration, climate interaction, subsistence strategies, and eventually imagination itself. It is both barrier and pathway, danger and resource, isolation and connection. But none of that meaning exists yet. At this moment, there's only the first sight of the horizon that refuses to end, and the realization, still forming slowly, that the world is larger than anything that came before it. The edge of the sea does not only divide land and water, it divides habits of life that have been stable for thousands of generations. To reach it, humans do not simply walk in a straight line from forest to shore. The journey is gradual, shaped by pressures that accumulate long before the ocean ever appears. Rivers shift their courses, game becomes less predictable, plant cycles tighten or fail. Inland environments, once reliable, begin to feel less generous, as if the land itself is slowly withdrawing its certainty. Small groups respond the way humans always have, by moving, not as a single migration event, but as countless decisions made over generations. A family leaves a familiar valley because the soil has grown thin. Another follows a river downstream because fish runs have changed. Others drift along seasonal routes that stretch further than before, testing the edges of what is known and what is merely assumed to be empty. In these movements, something subtle begins to happen. The mental map of the world expands, but unevenly. Some regions become deeply familiar through repeated use, while others remain vague, imagined only through stories or indirect signs. The ocean, at this stage, is not yet a destination. It is an absence in the mental geography, a place that is not yet fully real because it has never been directly experienced. Yet the forces pushing humans outward are real and immediate. Climatic shifts over long prehistoric periods reshape habitats in ways that are not dramatic in a single lifetime but profound across many. Ice advances and retreats, rainfall patterns shift, forest boundaries move like breathing organisms across continents. In response, human groups do not remain still. Mobility is not a choice but a requirement for survival. As some groups follow river systems outward, they encounter environments that feel increasingly unfamiliar. Rivers widen and slow. Freshwater begins to taste different, carrying more sediment or more mineral complexity. Seasonal flooding creates vast temporary wetlands where navigation becomes more difficult, but resources more abundant. These transitional zones become critical spaces of adaptation, where inland life starts to merge with something that will eventually become coastal existence. The psychological experience of these environments is important. Unlike forests or open plains, which present relatively stable patterns of survival cues, these transitional landscapes are unstable in rhythm. Water levels rise and fall unpredictably. Shorelines appear and disappear. Paths that were clear one season may vanish the next. For early humans, this instability forces a shift in attention from fixed geography to dynamic process. They begin to read the landscape not as a static map, but as a changing system. Even without awareness, this is the beginning of a cognitive transformation that will later be essential for understanding the ocean itself. Some groups continue further, following the direction of water rather than land. Rivers become guides, not just resources. The assumption grows that if water flows outward, it must eventually lead somewhere significant. This is not yet a scientific understanding, but a deeply intuitive one, shaped by experience. Water connects. Along these routes, signs begin to accumulate that hint at something beyond inland familiarity. Fish species appear that are not typical of upstream environments. Shell fragments are occasionally found embedded in sediment far from any visible shoreline. Salt content in water increases gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as distance decreases. Animals behave differently near these zones, gathering in patterns that suggest seasonal or migratory pressures tied to something unseen. For humans travelling these routes, each of these details is a fragment of a larger unknown system. Still, most groups do not interpret these signs as evidence of an enormous body of water beyond reach. Instead, they are understood locally as changes in river behaviour, as shifts in seasonal cycles, as variations in land productivity. The idea that all of this might be connected to something vast and continuous remains outside conceptual boundaries. Movement continues nonetheless. Survival requires following resources, and resources are increasingly concentrated in these transitional environments. Fishing becomes more important. Gathering expands into new plant species adapted to wet conditions. Hunting patterns adjust as animals migrate differently through marshlands and river deltas. Human toolkits begin to reflect this change subtly. With more emphasis on water-adjacent subsistence, though still far from full coastal specialization, it is here, in these liminal zones, that the inland world begins to loosen its hold. Forests no longer dominate every horizon. Instead, they appear in fragments, broken by open water channels and shifting mudflats. The sky feels larger in these spaces, not because it has changed, but because vertical structures are less dense. Sound travels differently as well. Without continuous tree cover, wind becomes more audible, carrying information from greater distances. For some individuals, this expansion of sensory range is unsettling. For others, it is an opportunity. The environment offers more information, but also demands more interpretation. Nothing can be taken for granted. Every sign must be read in context. And gradually, over generations, groups begin to move beyond purely inland identity. They are still not coastal people. That transformation will come much later, but they are no longer entirely disconnected from the idea of directional water movement towards something unknown. The river is no longer just a resource or boundary. It is becoming a pathway of possibility. Archaeological patterns from later periods suggest that early coastal adjacent populations often maintained strong cultural links to inland origins. Tools, burial practices, and symbolic behaviours show continuity across these zones, indicating that movement was not a rupture but an extension. Even so, the psychological experience of those who first approached the sea must have felt like a rupture. Because before the ocean is seen, it is already shaping life indirectly. Food sources become more dependent on aquatic systems. Travel routes begin to favour waterways over terrestrial paths. Group territories stretch along river networks rather than remaining clustered in forest or grassland zones. Over time, this creates elongated patterns of habitation that slowly draw populations toward the edges of continental landmasses. Yet even as movement continues, the idea of an ultimate boundary remains unformed. Inland life does not require imagining an end to land itself. Even vast deserts or mountain ranges are still understood as part of a continuous terrestrial system. There is always a path around, through, or beyond. The concept that land could simply stop is not yet part of lived experience. And so groups move forward without anticipating what awaits them. They follow water because water leads life. They follow animals because animals know routes humans do not. They follow seasonal cycles because survival depends on timing. None of these decisions are driven by knowledge of an ocean. All are driven by necessity. But necessity, over time, produces discovery. Each generation pushes slightly further into marginal environments. Each migration stretches the mental map outward by a small but irreversible amount. What once seemed like the edge of familiarity becomes normal terrain, and beyond that, another edge forms. It is this slow, cumulative expansion that eventually brings humans into contact with the environments that precede the ocean, not as a sudden arrival, but as a gradual narrowing of the unknown. Rivers widen, air grows heavier, the land begins to lose its strict definition, and somewhere ahead, still unimagined, the inland world prepares to dissolve into something entirely new. A river does not announce where it ends. It only changes, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty that something larger is approaching. The current widens, the banks soften, the water carries more suspended material, more fragments of distant landscapes broken down and rewritten by movement. For ancient humans following these waterways, nothing about this progression signals an ending, it signals continuation. But continuation, when stretched far enough, begins to feel like transformation. The group travelling downstream notices subtle shifts that do not demand immediate explanation, but accumulate in the body as quiet unease. The water is no longer as clear as it once was in upland stretches. It tastes slightly different, less fresh, carrying a faint mineral edge that lingers on the tongue. Fish behaviour changes too, with certain species appearing in greater density while others vanish entirely without clear reason. The river itself begins to feel less like a path and more like a system in motion. And still, they follow it. Because rivers are reliable in a way the wider landscape is not. They provide direction without interpretation. They offer water, food, and movement. They connect regions that would otherwise require difficult overland travel. For early humans, a river is not just a feature of geography, it is a living corridor of survival. Yet as the journey continues, the corridor begins to widen in ways that are difficult to ignore. The banks, once defined by clear boundaries of vegetation and soil, start to blur. Floodplains appear more frequently, stretching farther than before, sometimes merging into vast wet expanses where water and land intermingle without stable separation. Movement becomes more complex. Paths that were once straightforward now require detours, patience, and careful reading of seasonal conditions. In these environments, something important begins to shift in perception. The river is no longer experienced as a line, it becomes a field. And within that field, a subtle change in sensory experience emerges. The air grows heavier, especially during certain times of day. Moisture clings more persistently. Winds carry distant, unfamiliar rhythms that do not match inland weather patterns. Even the soundscape changes, with longer stretches of ambient noise that cannot be easily attributed to specific sources. At first, these changes are dismissed as normal variation. Rivers are known to change across seasons, but over time, the differences accumulate beyond what seasonal explanation can fully account for. Then comes the first truly disorienting shift. The water begins to move in ways that feel less predictable. Flow is no longer consistently directional in the expected sense. In some stretches, currents slow almost to stillness. In others, the river seems to broaden into vast, shallow expanses where direction becomes harder to perceive. The sense of upstream and downstream begins to blur, replaced by a more complex understanding of movement influenced by terrain that is no longer clearly defined. What is happening here is not yet understood in terms of tides or marine systems. Those concepts lie far beyond the cognitive horizon of the time. Instead, the experience is interpreted locally as unusual river behavior, seasonal flooding, or land that refuses to stabilize. But beneath these interpretations, something larger is forming. The river is approaching its final transformation. For thousands of kilometers in some cases, major river systems act as connectors between inland regions and coastal zones. As they near their mouths, they enter environments where fresh water begins to mix with salt water. This transitional zone is not abrupt. It is gradual, diffuse, and often visually deceptive. To early observers, it may appear as simply a wider river, or a series of wetlands that extend beyond normal expectations. But the sensory changes are undeniable. The taste of water becomes increasingly strange, not merely earthy or mineral, but distinctly altered in a way that does not match upstream conditions. The smell of the air shifts as well, carrying a faint sharpness that is difficult to categorize but impossible to ignore. Even vegetation begins to change, with plant species adapted to brackish conditions replacing those familiar from inland floodplains. Animal behavior becomes another crucial indicator. Bird populations increase dramatically in some regions, drawn by abundant aquatic life. Fish species shift again, with new varieties appearing that are not found farther upstream. Some of these species may have been entirely unknown to inland populations until this point, representing the first indirect contact between humans and marine ecosystems, even if not yet recognized as such. Still, the group does not understand that they are nearing an ocean. What they perceive is complexity, not boundary. Archaeological evidence from later coastal adjacent sites suggests that early human populations often developed extensive knowledge of estuarine environments before fully engaging with open coastlines. These transitional zones provided rich resources: fish, shellfish, birds, and plant life uniquely adapted to fluctuating salinity. But in this earliest phase of contact, none of this is yet systematized. It is simply a place that feels different. As they move deeper into these zones, the landscape becomes increasingly fragmented. Channels split and rejoin. Water spreads into braided networks that seem to have no fixed center. Movement requires constant adjustment. Paths are no longer linear but adaptive, responding to shifting conditions that change with rainfall, sediment flow, and seasonal flooding. This instability forces a change in attention. Humans begin to observe not just where things are, but how they change over time. Water levels become meaningful indicators. Soil consistency matters more than before. Animal tracks are read in relation to shifting terrain rather than fixed geography. In this way, cognition becomes more process-oriented, a critical adaptation that will later prove essential for understanding coastal and marine environments. Yet even with this growing awareness, the final transition remains invisible, because the ocean does not present itself as a destination at the end of a river. It presents itself as a continuation so vast that it erases the distinction between river and sea. At some point, the river ceases to feel like a river at all. The current slows and spreads until it loses its identity. The water no longer has a clear direction. Instead, it becomes part of something larger, something that moves according to forces no inland experience can fully prepare a mind to interpret. But for now, the group simply continues. They follow the water because it still carries them forward. They adapt because survival demands it. They observe because observation is the only way to remain oriented in a world that is becoming increasingly fluid. And somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of inland memory, the river is already beginning to dissolve into the vastness that will eventually be recognized as the edge of the known world. The wind changes before the water does. It arrives first as an unfamiliar pressure moving across the skin, a sensation that seems to come from a direction without clear origin. Inland winds are shaped by forests, mountains, and valleys. They carry scent and temperature in predictable patterns, filtered through landforms that give them identity. But here, near the widening end of a great river system, the wind loses that definition. It feels open, almost uncontained. For the small group moving through this landscape, the change is subtle enough at first to be ignored. Survival still demands attention to more immediate concerns: where to find fresh water, how to track fish movements, which stretches of ground remain stable enough to walk. Yet beneath these practical decisions, a deeper shift is taking place in the environment itself. The air begins to carry salt, not in a way that can be immediately identified, but as a faint alteration in taste and breath, a mineral sharpness that clings to the back of the throat. It is different from dust, different from smoke, different from the scent of dried earth after heat. It is persistent in a way that inland air is not. The group continues forward. They are not yet at the boundary they will one day recognize as the sea. Instead, they are moving through its long approach, where river systems lose coherence and begin to blend into something wider, more ambiguous. The land here is unstable in both physical and perceptual ways. Ground that once supported firm footing becomes soft and unpredictable. Water spreads across vast horizontal distances, forming shallow channels that cut and rejoin without clear order. Vegetation changes in response, shifting from dense inland forms to plants adapted to fluctuating moisture and salinity. The landscape feels as though it is constantly negotiating its own shape, and sound begins to change. The familiar acoustic world of forests and inland valleys fades. In its place is a continuous, low presence that does not behave like discrete sound events. It is not the call of animals, not the rustle of leaves, not the rush of a single river current. It is something broader, layered, and unending. At first, it is mistaken for wind, then for distant waterfalls, then for weather. But as the group moves further, it becomes clear that this sound does not originate from a single point. It surrounds them. It rises and falls, but never fully disappears. It is always there, like a background condition of the world itself. What they are approaching is still not understood as a sea. It is experienced as a zone of instability, where familiar categories of land and water begin to fail. The river, once a clear guide, now behaves differently. It no longer offers a single direction. Instead, it divides repeatedly, forming channels that loop and merge in complex patterns. In some places, it broadens so much that the opposite bank cannot be seen. In others, it disappears into wetlands where water and land are indistinguishable. Time spent in this environment changes perception. Distances become harder to judge. Paths that seem direct often require detours around shifting water. Landmarks lose reliability as reference points because they are partially submerged or altered by seasonal change. The mental map that worked inland begins to degrade under these conditions. This is not sudden confusion. It is gradual erosion of certainty. Early humans, like all humans, rely heavily on environmental consistency to build cognitive maps of space. When that consistency breaks down, the mind compensates by focusing more on process than structure. Instead of remembering fixed locations, attention shifts to patterns where water tends to rise, how animals move through changing terrain, how vegetation responds to moisture cycles. This adaptation is crucial, because without it, survival in such environments would be impossible. Still, even with increasing adaptation, something remains difficult to integrate into understanding the growing sense of vastness. The landscape no longer feels contained. even when surrounded by land. There is a persistent impression that something larger is nearby, influencing everything indirectly. It is not seen directly. It is felt through absence of boundaries. At night, this feeling intensifies. Without daylight reference points, the environment becomes even less structured. The sound persists, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but never absent. The air feels heavier, saturated with moisture that clings to skin and breath. Fires burn differently here, affected by humidity and wind patterns that do not behave as they do inland. Around these fires, early groups likely experienced heightened awareness of uncertainty, not fear in a modern sense, but a form of cognitive tension between recognition and incomprehension. The world still functions, still provides resources, still supports life, yet it no longer conforms to expectations formed in inland environments. And that discrepancy demands explanation. In the absence of scientific frameworks, explanation takes other forms. Patterns in wind and water may be attributed to spirit forces or unseen presences. The continuous sound may be interpreted as the voice of the environment itself. The instability of land and water may be understood as a boundary between known and unknown realms. But even these interpretations remain tentative, because the experience itself resists simplification. As the group moves deeper into this transitional world, they begin to encounter signs that cannot be easily dismissed as local variation. Shell fragments appear more frequently in sediment, some carried far inland by previous water movements, others newly exposed by shifting channels. Fish species become more diverse, including forms that do not resemble those found in upstream environments. Bird populations increase dramatically, drawn by abundant feeding opportunities in these rich ecological zones. The sky becomes more active, filled with movement that reflects the productivity of the landscape below. And still, the source of all this abundance remains unrecognized. It is not yet the ocean. It is the final approach to it, a place where river systems lose their identity, where fresh water yields to salt water in invisible gradients, where land begins to flatten and spread until it no longer behaves like inland terrain at all. For the group, there is no clear moment of arrival, only gradual realization that the world has changed shape, that what was once a river is no longer just a river, and that somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of familiar geography, something vast is already beginning to define the limits of their world. The forest does not end at a line. It thins, then fractures, then forgets how to continue. Trees that once stood in dense continuity begin to appear in scattered clusters, separated by stretches of wet ground that no longer behave like stable soil. Roots emerge above the surface, exposed and twisted, as if the land itself is being slowly pulled apart and rewritten by water. In some places, the forest still holds its shape. In others, it dissolves into open, shifting terrain where nothing remains fixed for long. For the group moving through this region, the change is not sudden enough to be alarming in a single moment. It is cumulative. Each day brings a slightly different version of the landscape. One morning, a path exists where none did before. Another day, a familiar route is partially submerged, forcing detours through unfamiliar channels of mud and shallow water. The ground begins to lose its authority. It no longer guarantees stability. It no longer promises continuity between one step and the next. Even solid-looking surfaces may conceal soft, waterlogged layers beneath. Every movement requires attention, adjustment, and constant reassessment. And yet life continues. Animals adapt quickly to these shifting environments. Some species retreat inland, Others move into newly formed wetlands. Birds become more prominent, their presence increasing as shallow waters provide abundant feeding grounds. Fish appear in unexpected places, moving through channels that open and close with seasonal rhythms. To early humans, this is not chaos, it is productivity. But it is a different kind of productivity than inland forests or grasslands offer. It is unstable, unpredictable, and layered with hidden complexity. Resources are abundant, yet access to them requires deeper understanding of changing environmental patterns. The air grows heavier here, not in weight, but in texture. Moisture becomes constant rather than intermittent. Even when it does not rain, the atmosphere feels saturated, as if the sky itself is holding water in suspension. Breathing becomes an experience of humidity and faint mineral taste, subtle but persistent. Wind behaves differently as well. It no longer moves cleanly across landforms. Instead, it breaks and reforms over open stretches of water and fragmented terrain. Sometimes it carries cool air from distant open spaces. Other times it stalls entirely, leaving stillness that feels unnatural compared to inland movement patterns. And beneath all of this, the sound continues. Always present, always changing slightly but never disappearing. The group cannot identify its source, yet it becomes part of their perceptual baseline. It is no longer an event they notice, but a condition they exist within. Like the presence of gravity or the passage of time, it is simply there. As they move further into this transitional zone, the landscape begins to flatten. Not suddenly, but through gradual reduction of vertical structure. Hills become less pronounced. Forest canopies become fragmented. Open spaces expand. Water spreads more widely across the terrain, forming shallow networks that stretch in multiple directions. It is here that the first true complexity of the coastal approach reveals itself. This is not simply river meeting land. It is a system of constant negotiation between freshwater and saltwater, sediment and tide, accumulation and dispersal. Though the group does not yet understand these processes, they experience their effects directly. Water levels shift in ways that are not fully explained by rainfall or upstream flow. Certain areas become temporarily flooded without obvious cause. Others recede unexpectedly, exposing new pathways. The environment behaves as if it has more than one rhythm. For inland minds, accustomed to seasonal predictability, this is difficult to integrate. The idea that water levels might be influenced by distant forces beyond visible weather patterns is not yet formed. Instead, each change is interpreted locally as unusual flooding, as unstable river behavior, as land that refuses to settle. But over time, interpretation begins to stretch, because the repetition of these changes cannot be ignored. Patterns emerge. Water rises and falls in ways that suggest a larger system at work. Certain times of day bring subtle shifts in movement. Certain stretches of terrain behave differently depending on conditions far beyond immediate perception. Still, there is no concept yet for what is approaching. Only experience. And experience is beginning to accumulate into something that cannot be fully explained by inland knowledge alone. The group encounters more shell fragments now, embedded in soil far from any obvious shoreline. Some are weathered and ancient, carried inland by previous water movements. Others appear fresher, suggesting more recent transport. These fragments are unfamiliar not only in appearance but in implication. They hint at a world of hard, structured forms living within water environments that are not yet visible. Fish diversity increases again, including species that do not match upstream ecological expectations. Some are larger, adapted to different feeding conditions. Others are smaller but more numerous, moving in dense patterns through shallow waters. Bird life becomes even more intense. The sky feels populated. Movement is constant above and around the wetlands, creating a layered environment where land, water, and air intersect in continuous exchange. And yet, despite all this richness, orientation becomes harder. Paths are no longer reliable lines. They are temporary agreements between water levels and ground stability. A route that exists in the morning may disappear by evening. Navigation becomes less about memory and more about real-time reading of environmental cues. This demands a cognitive shift. Humans begin to rely less on fixed mental maps and more on adaptive observation. Instead of remembering exact paths, they remember conditions where water tends to collect, how certain plants respond to flooding, how animals move through changing terrain. This is not yet conscious strategy. It is gradual adaptation shaped by necessity. And it prepares the mind for something even larger. Because beyond this region, the system that governs water movement becomes even less tied to inland logic. The river's identity continues to dissolve, the land continues to flatten, and the sense that something vast lies just beyond direct perception grows stronger with every step forward. Still, nothing reveals itself fully. Not yet. The group only knows that they are moving through a world that no longer behaves like the one they came from. A world where boundaries are no longer fixed, and where water is beginning to define everything in ways they cannot yet name. Fear does not always arrive as panic. In the environments where early humans approach the edge of the ocean, fear first appears as hesitation, as small interruptions in movement, as moments where the body pauses before the mind has fully understood why. It is not yet fear of danger in a direct sense. It is uncertainty about interpretation itself. The world is still functioning. Resources are still available. Nothing is immediately hostile in the way predators or storms inland can be. And yet something feels unstable in a deeper way, as if the rules that normally govern landscape behavior are no longer fully reliable. The most immediate source of this unease is motion. Not the motion of animals or wind, which are familiar, but the motion of the environment itself. Water does not simply flow here. It spreads, pools, divides, and reforms across a wide horizontal plane that resists clear organization. What once was a river begins to resemble a network of shifting surfaces rather than a single channel. For groups moving through this region, direction becomes increasingly ambiguous. Upstream and downstream lose clarity. Side channels open unexpectedly. Wetlands expand and contract. Ground that appears stable may soften without warning. Even the horizon becomes difficult to use as a reference point, because open water reflects sky in ways that distort depth perception. The mind struggles to stabilize this complexity. In inland environments, environmental motion is usually tied to cause wind moves, grass, rain fills rivers, animals create tracks. Here, motion appears less tied to immediate cause and more to distant, unseen systems. Water rises without visible rainfall. Currents shift without obvious explanation. The landscape behaves as if influenced by forces beyond direct observation. This is where interpretation begins to fracture. Early humans do not yet have the conceptual tools to understand tidal systems or coastal hydrodynamics. Instead, they rely on localized explanations. Flooding is attributed to seasonal variation. Unusual water movement is seen as unstable river behavior. Changes in salinity are perceived as gradual alteration of freshwater systems. But these explanations begin to feel insufficient, because the patterns repeat, and repetition suggests structure. One of the most striking experiences in this transitional zone is the persistence of sound. The continuous low presence that first began near the coastal approach has now become dominant. It fills gaps in perception, rising and falling in slow, irregular cycles. At times it is distant and subtle. At other moments it feels close, surrounding, almost physical in its presence. It does not behave like sound from a single source. It behaves like the aggregate result of countless interactions across a vast surface. But this interpretation does not yet exist. Instead, the sound is experienced as a property of the environment itself, something inherent to the place rather than produced by anything identifiable. It is part of the landscape in the same way that wind is part of forests, or silence is part of caves. And because it has no clear origin, it becomes psychologically significant. Humans tend to assign meaning to persistent sensory input that cannot be easily categorized. In the absence of explanation, perception begins to lean toward interpretation shaped by emotional response rather than empirical structure. So the sound becomes something else. Not just noise, but presence. The land itself seems to be expressing something, though what it expresses remains unclear. This is where early mythic thinking begins to form, not as structured belief systems, but as tentative associations between environmental behavior and unseen agency. The ocean, though not yet recognized as such, begins to acquire qualities of intentionality and perception. It moves continuously. It produces sound continuously. It changes without visible cause. To minds accustomed to discrete events, this continuity feels alive. The group continues forward, but movement is no longer simple. Wetlands now dominate large portions of the terrain. Channels of water intersect in complex patterns. Some areas require careful navigation through shallow but unstable ground. Others require following narrow strips of elevated land that twist unpredictably through flooded zones. The effort of movement increases, not because distance is greater, but because predictability is reduced. This reduction in predictability affects more than physical travel. It alters attention. Every step requires assessment. Every surface requires evaluation. Even resting places must be chosen with caution, as water levels may shift overnight. And yet, despite these challenges, resources are abundant. Fish are plentiful. Shellfish appear in increasing numbers. Birds gather in dense populations. Plant life adapted to brackish conditions becomes a reliable food source. In some ways, this is a landscape of extraordinary productivity. But it is a productivity that does not behave like inland abundance. It is unstable, seasonal, and spatially fragmented. To exploit it requires flexibility rather than fixed knowledge. This is where human adaptation begins to shift in subtle but important ways. Tool use becomes more specialized for aquatic environments. Observation of water behavior becomes more important than tracking large terrestrial animals. Group movement patterns begin to stretch along water systems rather than clustering around fixed inland sites. Still, there is no understanding of what lies beyond. The idea that all of this is part of a single vast system remains inaccessible. Instead, what is experienced is fragmentation, many connected wetlands, many shifting channels, many local systems that behave in related but not fully understood ways. Occasionally, the ground reveals more evidence of connection. Shells appear in clusters far from any visible large water body. Some are embedded deep in sediment layers, suggesting long-term environmental change. Others appear more recent, indicating ongoing transport through water movement. These fragments hint at continuity beyond perception, but they do not yet define it. Even as the group moves deeper into this region, the sense of approaching something larger intensifies. The sound grows more consistent. The air remains saturated with moisture and salt. The horizon remains open and unstable, lacking the clear boundaries that characterize inland landscapes. And still, no clear endpoint appears. There is only continuation, only expansion, only the slow dissolution of familiar structure into something that cannot yet be named. What they are approaching is not a place in the traditional sense. It is a transition so vast that it reshapes everything around it. And beyond that transition, the world is already preparing to reveal its next form. The first shells are not noticed as evidence of anything extraordinary. They are simply objects in the soil, small, hard fragments that interrupt the softness of wet ground, occasionally catching light in ways that make them briefly visible before being stepped over or washed aside. In inland environments, such objects are usually dismissed as stones, weathered minerals, or the remnants of long-forgotten geological processes. There's no immediate reason to interpret them as something significant. But they appear again, and again, not in isolated instances, but in repeated patterns that begin to emerge across different parts of this transitional landscape. Some are found embedded in sediment layers far from any visible large body of water. Others are uncovered along shifting channels where water has recently receded. A few appear in higher ground, suggesting they were transported and deposited by forces that are not immediately obvious. At first, they are not connected. They are just fragments. Yet over time, the accumulation becomes difficult to ignore. The objects are not like inland stones. Their structure is different. Their surfaces are smooth in a way that suggests continuous shaping by movement rather than static erosion. Some retain faint ridges or spirals that indicate biological origin, though this concept is not yet understood in those terms. To the group moving through this landscape, these fragments are simply unusual, but they introduce a subtle cognitive disruption, because they do not fit existing categories of inland material culture or natural debris. The environment around them continues its slow transformation. Water spreads in complex patterns across the land. Vegetation shifts towards species adapted to fluctuating salinity. The air remains heavy with moisture and faint mineral taste, and the continuous sound persists, unchanged in presence but varying slightly in intensity. Within this environment, the shells become a quiet anomaly. They do not explain anything on their own, but they accumulate meaning through repetition. Each fragment suggests that something exists beyond the immediate horizon of perception, something that produces these forms, something that exists within water systems large enough to sustain organisms with structured external bodies. Without realizing it, early humans are encountering indirect evidence of a biological world that operates differently from inland ecosystems. But interpretation remains local. The shells are not yet understood as part of a marine system. Instead, they may be seen as remnants of unusual river life, or as objects carried from distant inland waters during extreme flooding events. Even when found in large quantities, they do not immediately force a conceptual shift. They are absorbed into existing frameworks of environmental variation. Still, they persist, and persistence creates pressure. Further movement brings the group into even more complex wetland systems. Here, water is not confined to channels but spreads across broad, shallow expanses that change shape with subtle variations in flow. Some areas are submerged only during certain periods, revealing exposed ground at others. Others remain permanently saturated, forming unstable terrain that shifts under weight. Navigation becomes increasingly dependent on environmental reading. The group begins to track water behavior more carefully than land features. Depth, movement, clarity, and taste become essential indicators. Even the behavior of animals becomes more critical for understanding safe pathways. Birds that feed in shallow waters indicate zones of abundance. Fish movement suggests deeper channels. Insects reveal seasonal transitions in water coverage. This is not yet formal knowledge. It is accumulated experience. But it is becoming structured. The environment itself is forcing a shift in perception. Fixed geography becomes less useful. Process becomes more important than location. The world is no longer understood as a static arrangement of places, but as a dynamic system of changing conditions. And still, something larger remains just beyond comprehension. The sound continues to evolve in subtle ways. It is no longer interpreted simply as wind or distant environmental noise. It has become a constant presence that shapes emotional response. At times it is calming, at others unsettling. Its continuity suggests something that does not rest, something that does not break or pause in the way inland environments do. This continuity is psychologically significant. In inland life, most environmental processes are cyclical: day and night, wet and dry seasons, migration and return. Even large rivers have predictable rhythms, but here, rhythm feels less segmented. It feels continuous, layered, and expansive. The mind begins to adjust, not consciously, but through repeated exposure. Over time, perception adapts to include variability as normal. This is a critical cognitive shift. It allows humans to function in environments where stability is not guaranteed. It also prepares them for the eventual encounter with the ocean, where motion is not periodic in the same way inland systems are understood. But that understanding is still far ahead. For now, the group continues through increasingly fragmented terrain. At times, they encounter stretches where water and land are so interwoven that boundaries disappear entirely. Ground may appear solid but quickly give way under pressure. Water may seem shallow, but extend unexpectedly in hidden channels. Every step requires reassessment. The cost of movement increases, not in terms of distance, but in terms of attention. And attention itself becomes a resource that must be managed. Despite this difficulty, abundance remains present. Fish, shellfish, birds, and plants continue to provide sustenance in quantities not typically seen in inland environments. This abundance creates a paradox, a landscape that is difficult to traverse but rich in resources. Such conditions encourage longer stays, more exploration, greater familiarity with a changing system. And through this gradual engagement, humans begin to integrate themselves into the transitional zone without fully understanding its structure. The shells remain part of this system, quietly accumulating across time and space. Each one a fragment of a larger world not yet visible. Each one a hint that beyond the shifting wetlands and unstable ground, there is a source that has not yet been reached. The group does not yet know that they are moving closer to an ocean, but the environment is already reshaping their perception in preparation for that realization. Step by step, fragment by fragment, the inland world is giving way to something far larger than anything they have previously known. There is a moment when walking forward no longer guarantees arrival. It is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a gradual weakening of certainty rather than a sudden break from it. The group continues to move through the wetland corridors and fragmented channels, but the relationship between effort and progress begins to feel less reliable. Distance no longer behaves in a predictable way. Paths that should lead somewhere familiar sometimes dissolve into open water. Others loop back into themselves without clear reason. This is where the land stops acting like a map and begins behaving like a system without edges. The terrain has become a complex weave of shallow waters, soft ground, and shifting channels that respond to forces beyond immediate perception. Rainfall, upstream flow, sediment deposition, and distant tidal influence all contribute to patterns that are not visible in isolation. To those living within it, however, the result is simply instability. Movement requires constant adjustment. Every step is an assessment. Every direction is provisional. The group has by now developed a deep familiarity with reading water behavior. They can distinguish between shallow and deep channels, between stable ground and sediment that will collapse under weight. They can read bird movements to identify feeding zones and track fish patterns to locate productive areas. This knowledge is not formalized, but it is increasingly sophisticated. Yet even with this adaptation, something remains fundamentally difficult to grasp. The sense that the environment is expanding beyond interpretability. The sound that has followed them for so long now feels less like a background presence and more like a defining feature of space itself. It is constant, but not static. It rises and falls in long cycles that seem to have no origin within the visible landscape. Sometimes it intensifies, filling the environment with a deep, layered presence. Other times it recedes slightly, creating brief moments of relative quiet that feel almost unnatural in comparison. It is no longer something they notice. It is something they live within. At this stage of the journey, the landscape begins to flatten further, not in the sense of becoming simpler, but in the sense of losing vertical structure that once provided orientation. Hills are rare, dense forest is fragmented, even large riverbanks no longer define clear boundaries. Instead, water spreads horizontally across wide areas, forming interconnected systems that stretch toward an unseen horizon. The concept of edge becomes increasingly unstable, and yet the group continues forward, because survival still depends on movement through this region. The abundance of resources remains compelling. Fish are plentiful in shallow waters. Shellfish gather in rich clusters along sediment beds. Birds move in large populations across the open spaces. Plant life adapted to fluctuating salinity provides reliable gathering opportunities. It is a landscape that resists traversal but rewards persistence. This combination creates a strong ecological pull. Groups do not simply pass through, they begin to use it, to rely on it, to learn its rhythms over time. Seasonal changes become important indicators of where resources will concentrate. Water levels determine accessibility. Animal movements reveal hidden structures beneath the surface. But even as familiarity increases, uncertainty does not decrease. Instead, it evolves. Because now the uncertainty is not about individual paths or resources. It is about the nature of the system itself. At times, the group encounters stretches of water so wide that the opposite side is no longer visible. These are not yet recognized as coastal horizons, but they introduce a perceptual shift that is difficult to ignore. The idea that water can extend beyond sight without interruption challenges inland assumptions about containment. Water, in inland understanding, always has limits. Even large lakes are bounded, rivers are directional, floods recede. But here, water begins to suggest continuity without clear termination. This is an important psychological threshold, because once the mind encounters a phenomenon that appears unbounded, it must either expand its conceptual framework or reinterpret the experience within existing categories. Early humans in this stage just tend toward reinterpretation. Wide water becomes an expanded wetland. Large channels become seasonal flood zones. Extended horizons are understood as distant landforms obscured by atmospheric conditions. But reinterpretation becomes increasingly strained. especially when repeated experience contradicts it. Shell fragments continue to appear across these widening environments, not as isolated finds, but as recurring elements within sediment and shoreline deposits. Their presence becomes more frequent and more difficult to dismiss as accidental transport. They're no longer anomalies. They are patterns, and patterns imply a source. Still, the source remains unseen. The group begins to spend longer periods in these environments, not because they have fully adapted, but because the cost of movement is balanced by the richness of available resources. Over time, this leads to deeper familiarity with the transitional zone. They begin to recognize local variations in water behavior. Certain areas consistently produce higher biological activity. Others remain stable across seasons. Some channels behave differently depending on subtle environmental changes that are not yet understood but are increasingly predictable through experience. This growing knowledge does not resolve the larger mystery. It deepens it. Because the more the system is understood locally, the more its overall structure resists definition. It is at this stage that perception begins to shift in a more profound way. The environment is no longer seen as a collection of separate features. It begins to feel like a continuous presence. Water, land, air, sound, and movement all merge into a single integrated system that does not conform to inland categories. This is not yet conceptualized as an ocean, but it is the experiential foundation upon which that concept will eventually be built. For now, it is simply the world at its edge, a world that no longer behaves like the world that came before it, and one that continues to expand in ways that cannot yet be fully understood. The sound becomes impossible to ignore when it stops pretending to be separate from the landscape. At this stage of the journey, the group no longer experiences it as something in the background. It is not wind, not distant water, not the echo of movement through channels. It is simply there, filling space with a continuity that seems to extend beyond any single direction. When they pause, it remains. When they move, it follows without delay. When night arrives, it does not change in kind, only in intensity. It has become a constant condition of the world, and that constancy begins to reshape perception in quiet but fundamental ways. In inland environments, silence is meaningful. It signals absence of disturbance, presence of rest, or distance from activity. Sound arrives in discrete events, animals moving through brush, wind passing through trees, water breaking over stone. Each has a beginning and an end. Each can be traced to a source. Here, those boundaries dissolve. The sound does not begin or end. It does not originate from a single point. It does not behave as an event. Instead, it behaves as an environment-wide expression of movement that cannot be localized. For early humans, this is difficult to process, because cognition is built on the assumption that effects have causes that can be identified within the same perceptual frame. When that assumption fails, interpretation shifts toward broader explanations. The environment is no longer seen as a collection of interacting parts. It begins to feel like a single integrated presence. This is where perception crosses a subtle threshold. The landscape is no longer just inhabited. It is experienced as active. The group continues through widening channels and open wetland systems. The terrain now includes large stretches of shallow water that reflect the sky in fragmented, shifting patterns. At times, it becomes difficult to distinguish where land ends and water begins. The surface appears continuous in some places, broken in others, constantly reshaped by unseen forces. Distance becomes unreliable. Objects that appear close may be separated by unstable ground or hidden channels. Features that seem distant may shift with changes in light or atmospheric clarity. The mind struggles to maintain consistent spatial mapping, and instead begins to rely more heavily on immediate sensory cues. Touch becomes more important than sight. Sound becomes more important than distance. And movement becomes more important than fixed location. This shift in sensory prioritization is not abrupt. It emerges gradually through repeated exposure to environments that resist stable interpretation. At the same time, ecological richness increases. Shallow waters teem with life. Fish are more abundant than inland rivers in certain seasons. Shellfish cluster in dense formations along sediment beds. Birds gather in vast numbers, their movements creating constant motion across the sky. Even plant life becomes more diverse in these transitional zones, with species adapted to fluctuating water levels and salinity gradients. To an observer from an earlier inland environment, this would appear paradoxical. A place that is difficult to navigate but rich in resources. A place that resists stability but supports abundance. And this paradox is part of what draws human groups deeper into it. Because survival is not only about ease of movement, it is about availability of energy, and here, energy is concentrated in ways that inland systems do not always provide. Still, abundance does not translate into clarity. Each productive zone exists within a larger system that remains difficult to interpret as a whole. Water levels change without obvious local cause. Channels shift course over time. Areas that are productive one season may become less so in another. The environment behaves as if governed by rhythms that are broader than any single vantage point can reveal. This is where indirect evidence begins to accumulate more strongly. Shell fragments continue to appear, now in greater density and distribution. Some are embedded in older sediment layers, indicating long-term environmental processes. Others are found in more recent deposits, suggesting ongoing transport and deposition. Their presence is no longer rare or surprising. It is consistent enough to imply a continuous source, but the source itself remains invisible, because it lies beyond the current perceptual horizon. At night, the sound intensifies in perception, even if its physical properties do not change dramatically. Without visual reference points, the auditory environment becomes dominant. The continuous presence fills the darkness, shaping spatial awareness in ways that inland environments rarely require. Fires burn differently here as well. Humidity affects combustion. Smoke disperses in irregular patterns. Heat does not feel as contained. Even rest becomes more difficult, as the environment does not fully quiet in the way inland night cycles do. This creates a subtle but persistent cognitive load. The group must remain partially alert even during rest, maintaining awareness of environmental changes that could affect safety or movement. Over time, this contributes to a different relationship with the environment, not one of control, but of continuous negotiation. They are not shaping the land. They are adapting to its ongoing transformation, and that transformation continues to push outward toward a boundary that is not yet understood as such. At certain points, the group encounters stretches where the water extends so far that visual continuity breaks down. The surface merges with atmospheric haze. The horizon becomes indistinct. What is land and what is water becomes increasingly difficult to separate at a distance. These moments are critical, even if not yet recognized as such, because they represent the first direct encounter with scale that exceeds inland framing. Not just large environments, but continuous ones. Spaces where boundaries are no longer obvious or stable. And yet, even here, there is no clear sense of arrival. Only continuation. Only expansion. only the growing awareness that the world they are moving through is not composed of separate parts, but of a single vast system that behaves according to rules still beyond comprehension. Somewhere ahead, that system is approaching its most complete expression. But for now, it remains only partially visible, a presence without a defined edge. A world still unfolding, storms do not begin at the moment they are seen. They begin earlier, in the pressure changes that no human can yet read, in the distant movement of air over vast open surfaces, in the slow gathering of energy across regions that are far beyond immediate perception. For inland life, storms are usually local events. They form within a recognizable frame of sky and land, shaped by mountains, forests, and valleys. Here, near the expanding edge of water systems, storms feel different. Less local, more like a rival. The group does not yet understand what they are witnessing in scientific terms. There is no concept of large-scale atmospheric systems interacting with vast water surfaces. Instead, what they experience is a gradual transformation of the environment. The air becomes heavier, more charged. The wind shifts direction in ways that feel less predictable than inland patterns. Animals react first. Birds begin to move differently, gathering in dense groups or retreating inland. Fish activity changes in shallow waters, becoming more erratic or concentrated in deeper channels. Even insects behave with noticeable variation, disappearing from exposed areas before the change fully arrives. To those moving through the landscape, these are signs, not of a system, but of a mood in the environment. The sound that has followed them for so long begins to change in intensity. It grows louder, more layered, as if multiple movements are being combined into a single continuous expression. It is no longer possible to separate wind noise from water movement, from atmospheric pressure. Everything seems to merge into one expanding presence. Then the storm arrives. Not as a single moment of impact, but as a gradual overwhelming of conditions. Wind accelerates across the open, fragmented landscape. Water surfaces become unstable, shifting from calm reflection to broken motion. Rain begins, not in isolated drops, but as sustained movement across space, blurring the boundary between air and water even further. For inland humans, storms often interact with structured environments. Trees absorb wind, hills redirect flow, valleys channel rain. Here, there is less structure to resist the force. The environment is open, low, and fluid. This allows energy to spread more evenly and more visibly across the landscape. The result is a different kind of experience. Less localized intensity, more total immersion. The group seeks shelter where possible, but shelter itself is not always clearly defined. In fragmented wetlands, protective structures are limited, trees are sparse, elevated ground is rare. Even slight rises in terrain can become temporary refuge, but they are not permanent solutions. The storm does not destroy the landscape in a single dramatic event. Instead, it reveals its instability. Water levels rise in some areas, spread in others. Channels shift direction. Previously stable paths disappear beneath shallow flooding. The surface of the land becomes even less reliable than before, as if the system is briefly exposing its deeper volatility. And yet this volatility is not random. It follows patterns shaped by forces far larger than immediate perception can capture. For the group, however, it is experienced as unpredictability, a reminder that the environment is not fully readable. During this time, the sound becomes almost overwhelming. It is no longer something in the background of perception. It fills the entire sensory field. The distinction between individual sounds collapses entirely. Wind, water, rain, and movement merge into a single continuous force that defines the experience of space. In such moments, orientation becomes difficult. Distance loses meaning. Direction becomes uncertain. Even time feels altered, as repeated cycles of intensity and brief partial relief create a sense of continuity without clear segmentation. But storms also reveal something important. They reveal scale, not in a conceptual sense, but in an experiential one. The group begins to sense that the environment they inhabit is not simply a collection of local systems. It is part of something larger, something that extends beyond visible boundaries and immediate conditions. Water does not behave independently here. It responds to broader forces. Air is not confined to local patterns. It moves across vast regions, and the interaction between these elements produces effects that cannot be fully explained within the limits of inland experience. After the storm passes, the landscape does not return to its previous state. It shifts. Some areas are reshaped by water movement. Sediment is redistributed. Channels are altered. New shallow pools appear, while others disappear or merge into larger bodies. Vegetation may be partially submerged or displaced. Paths that existed before may no longer be accessible in the same way. This reinforces a key realization, even if it is not consciously articulated. The environment here is not static. It is continuously reorganizing itself, and human presence within it must adapt accordingly. In the aftermath, the group observes changes in resource distribution. Some areas become richer in fish due to altered water flow. Others temporarily lose productivity. Shell fragments, already present in the landscape, are redistributed further, appearing in new locations where water has carried them during the storm. This movement of fragments reinforces the sense that everything is connected through water. Even without understanding the full system, the evidence accumulates. There is a source. There is movement. There is a continuity that extends beyond immediate sight. As the group continues after the storm, the environment feels subtly different. Not calmer, but more exposed, as if the temporary disruption has revealed the underlying structure of the landscape more clearly than before. And in that structure, the sense of approaching something vast becomes even stronger. Not yet understood, not yet named, but increasingly present in every direction that water extends. At a certain point, the landscape stops feeling like a place and starts feeling like a presence that cannot be left behind. The group continues moving through the widening coastal systems, but something subtle has changed in how they relate to everything around them. The water is no longer just a resource or obstacle. It is no longer even just a system. It has become a constant companion to perception itself, shaping every decision, every pause, every direction of movement. And with that shift, the mind begins to assign new kinds of meaning to what it cannot fully explain. The continuous sound, once treated as an environmental background, is now experienced with a kind of emotional weight. It is not loud in a simple sense. It is persistent in a way that does not allow true absence, even when diminished by distance or terrain. It returns, always returning, as if the landscape cannot exist without it. In the absence of inland structure trees forming walls of sound, rivers defining clear paths, hills breaking wind, the world here feels open in a way that removes containment. That openness is not empty. It is filled with movement that never resolves into stillness. And the human mind, shaped by millions of years of environments where things begin and end, struggles to interpret this continuity. This is where early mythic thinking begins to take root, not as formal belief systems, but as emerging patterns of interpretation. The environment appears active, not in the sense of life as animals or plants are alive, but in a broader sense of presence. The wind does not simply pass through space, it seems to carry intention. The water does not merely move, it seems to respond to unseen forces. The continuous sound does not simply exist, it feels like expression. These are not deliberate inventions. They are cognitive attempts to stabilize uncertainty. In inland environments, explanation is often straightforward. Causes are local, effects are visible. A broken branch can be traced to wind or animal movement. A flooded river can be traced to rainfall. Even unpredictable events eventually find a place within known cycles. Here, causality becomes harder to isolate. Changes in water levels may not correspond directly to local rainfall. Movement in the landscape may not follow visible triggers. The system feels influenced by forces that are distributed across time and space, rather than concentrated in one location. Without knowledge of tides, ocean currents, or large-scale atmospheric interactions, the mind fills the gap with broader interpretations. And so the ocean, still not recognized as such, begins to acquire a kind of identity and perception, not as a place, but as something that acts. The group's continued movement brings them deeper into this system where fresh water and salt water are no longer separate categories but overlapping conditions. The taste of water varies depending on location and time. Some channels remain fresh longer. Others carry subtle changes that accumulate gradually until they are unmistakable. These variations are noticed, but not fully understood. What is clear is that the environment is no longer uniform. It is stratified, layered, and constantly shifting between states that do not remain fixed. This creates a cognitive challenge, because classification becomes unreliable. Inland knowledge systems rely on relatively stable categories: forest, river, mountain, plain. Each has predictable properties, but here those categories begin to overlap. A single location may behave like multiple environments depending on season, tide influence, or upstream changes. The mind adapts by focusing less on fixed identity and more on behavioral patterns. Where water goes. How animals respond? When conditions shift. This adaptation is crucial for survival in such transitional landscapes. It allows humans to function without requiring complete understanding of underlying mechanisms. Still, fragments of evidence continue to accumulate. Shells appear more frequently now, sometimes in large clusters. Some are clearly ancient, embedded in deeper sediment layers. Others are fresher, suggesting ongoing biological activity nearby. Their presence is no longer surprising, but it remains significant, because it consistently points toward a source that has not yet been directly observed. Alongside these shells, other signs increase. Fish diversity grows, bird populations intensify, vegetation adapts more clearly to brackish conditions. Even the behavior of wind seems to change subtly, influenced by the expanding open water beyond immediate perception. And yet, even as evidence accumulates, the full picture remains just out of reach. The group moves through increasingly open terrain where water stretches farther than before. In some directions, there is no visible boundary. The horizon becomes less defined, merging water and sky in ways that make distance difficult to judge. These moments are important, though not yet understood as such. They represent encounters with scale that cannot be easily reduced to inland frameworks. The mind tries to interpret them as expanded wetlands, or distant flooded plains, or seasonal inundation zones. But each explanation begins to stretch under repeated exposure, because the experience remains consistent. Water extends. Sound continues. The environment does not resolve into a clear endpoint. it persists, and persistence, when unbounded, begins to resemble something infinite in perception. At night, this effect becomes even stronger. Without visual structure, the continuous sound dominates awareness. It fills space in a way that feels total, even if the physical intensity remains unchanged. Fires provide temporary focal points, but beyond their reach, the environment remains open and uncontained. Over time, this shapes a new kind of environmental familiarity, not based on stability, but on continuity. The group does not yet understand that they are approaching the ocean in its full expression. They only understand that they are moving through a world that no longer behaves like inland space. A world where boundaries are uncertain, where systems overlap, where everything is connected through movement that cannot be fully seen. And somewhere ahead, that movement is becoming something larger still. Something that will eventually define the edge of human experience itself. By the time the shoreline begins to reveal itself in fragments, it no longer feels like an arrival. It feels like a slow permission. The group has been moving through transitional wetlands for so long that the environment no longer changes in sudden steps. Instead, it shifts in gradients so subtle that recognition happens only in hindsight. Water is not simply more present now. It is more dominant in how space organizes itself. Land no longer asserts itself as the primary structure of the world. It is secondary, and sometimes it disappears entirely from view. What begins to emerge is not a single coastline, but a fragmented edge where water and land refuse to settle into fixed boundaries. Narrow strips of elevated ground stretch between open expanses of shallow sea. Some areas remain submerged longer than others. Some dry briefly before being reclaimed again. The land behaves less like a solid mass and more like something negotiated continuously by water movement. For inland minds, this is difficult to categorize, because there is no stable reference point. The group continues to rely on the same adaptive strategies developed in the wetland transition zones. They read water depth, track animal movement, observe vegetation changes, and follow subtle shifts in ground texture. But now these signals exist within a much larger frame of instability. The scale has expanded, and with it, the difficulty of interpretation. The sound, which has accompanied them for so long, now reveals new layers. It is no longer just a continuous presence. It has texture. It rises and falls in broad cycles that suggest interaction between multiple movements across vast open surfaces. At certain times, it becomes stronger near open stretches of water and softer near fragmented land pockets. It is still not understood, but it is no longer ignored. In this zone, the group encounters something that challenges even their adapted perception of the landscape horizons that no longer behave like boundaries. In inland environments, a horizon is a limit of vision. It defines where land meets sky. It provides orientation, direction, and scale. Here, however, the horizon becomes unstable. It shifts depending on atmospheric conditions, light reflection, and the presence of vast open water surfaces that merge visually with the sky. At times, it appears as if the world has no edge at all, just continuation. This produces a subtle cognitive tension, because perception suggests openness without boundary, but experience still requires navigation, survival, and direction. The mind attempts to resolve this by breaking the environment into smaller, manageable segments: safe ground, shallow water, deeper channels, resource-rich zones, but the broader structure remains unresolved. It is too large to map in a single framework. At the same time, biological abundance reaches a peak in many of these coastal zones. The mixing of fresh water and salt water creates highly productive ecosystems. Fish populations are dense and diverse. Shellfish form extensive beds along sediment-rich areas. Birds gather in extraordinary numbers, feeding, nesting, and migrating through interconnected habitats. From a survival perspective, this is a remarkable environment. But it is also unstable, because productivity is tied to movement. Tides, currents, seasonal shifts, and weather patterns all influence resource distribution. What is abundant in one area may shift elsewhere within days or weeks. This forces a constant recalibration of knowledge and movement. The group does not yet understand tides as a global system influenced by distant forces. Instead, they perceive rhythmic changes as part of local environmental behavior. Water appears to rise and fall with its own rhythm, independent of immediate cause. This perception is not incorrect in experience, but incomplete in explanation. Shell fragments now appear in even more varied contexts. Some are embedded deep within older sediment layers, indicating long-term environmental accumulation. Others are actively transported by shifting waters, appearing in newly exposed areas after changes in flow. These fragments begin to form a quiet continuity across space. They are no longer isolated anomalies. They are evidence of a larger hidden system. Even without full understanding, the implication grows stronger. There is a vast source beyond visible land, producing and distributing these materials across the landscape. Yet that source remains just beyond direct sight. Because the ocean, in its full form, is not always revealed from inland approaches as a singular moment of arrival. It is often encountered through gradual dissolution of river systems into estuaries, deltas, and coastal seas that stretch outward without immediate definition. The group is now within that dissolution. Rivers no longer behave as rivers in the traditional sense. They widen until their identity becomes diffuse. Channels split and merge in complex networks that resist linear interpretation. Freshwater influence weakens in some areas, replaced by a subtle but growing presence of saltwater systems. This transition is not abrupt. It is layered, and that layering creates uncertainty in classification. But experience continues to accumulate, and with it recognition begins to form at the edges of perception. Not yet a full concept, but a growing awareness that what lies ahead is not simply more land or more river. It is something fundamentally different in scale and behavior. The group continues forward through this shifting boundary zone, where every step is shaped by the interaction between two worlds that no longer remain distinct. And beyond that interaction, something vast continues to expand, just out of complete understanding, waiting to be fully seen. Movement along the shore begins to reshape the meaning of distance itself. What once required inland thinking, clear paths, fixed destinations, stable landmarks now become something more fluid. The group is no longer travelling through a single continuous environment. Instead, they are moving through a shifting boundary where land, water, and air constantly exchange dominance depending on time, weather, and unseen cycles. The coastline is not a line. It is a zone. A wide, unstable region where the world refuses to settle into a single form. Here, travel becomes less about reaching a point and more about following conditions that allow movement at all. Certain stretches of ground are only passable during low water periods. Others require detours through shallow channels or elevated ridges of sand and stone. In some places, movement is dictated entirely by the behavior of water, which reshapes pathways faster than memory can fully track. Even the idea of direction begins to weaken. Inland, direction is anchored by geography. Rivers flow downhill, Mountains rise, forests extend across known territories. At the coast, those anchors dissolve into overlapping systems of movement. Water flows in multiple directions depending on tide influence. Wind shifts unpredictably across open surfaces. Land itself is fragmented, no longer forming continuous reference structures. The group adapts, but adaptation is now continuous rather than gradual. There is no stable baseline to return to. And yet, despite this instability, the environment continues to provide. This is one of the most striking contradictions of the coastal world. It is difficult to navigate, but rich in resources. It is unstable in structure, but abundant in life. Fish populations thrive in shallow waters where nutrients concentrate. Shellfish form dense, accessible clusters along sediment beds. Birds converge in massive numbers, creating seasonal cycles of movement and feeding that can be anticipated with careful observation. The group begins to recognize that survival here depends not on control, but on timing. Knowing when water recedes, knowing when animals gather, knowing when pathways become temporarily accessible. This is a shift from spatial thinking to temporal thinking, and it changes how knowledge is structured. Instead of memorizing fixed locations, the group begins to memorize patterns of change. The landscape becomes something that must be read repeatedly rather than remembered once. Each return reveals a slightly different version of the same place. Nothing is static. Everything's conditional. The sound, which has never fully left perception since the earliest approach to these regions, now feels deeply integrated into environmental awareness. It rises and falls in broad, layered rhythms that seem to correspond with movements far beyond immediate sight. At times, it intensifies along open stretches of water. At other times, it recedes into a lower, continuous presence that still fills awareness even when not dominant. It has become a reference point in itself, not something analyzed, but something felt. Along these expanding coastal systems, the group encounters increasingly clear evidence that the fragments they have been finding for so long are part of a larger biological continuity. Shells appear in dense accumulations along shorelines. Some are broken and weathered, others intact and recently deposited. Their presence is no longer scattered. It is structured, tied to specific zones where water movement concentrates biological material. This suggests a productive system operating at a scale beyond inland ecosystems. But it is still not fully understood as a single entity, because what unifies it remains out of sight. The group occasionally reaches vantage points where water extends farther than expected. From these positions, the horizon appears less like an endpoint and more like a continuous merging of water and sky. In certain atmospheric conditions, the boundary between them disappears entirely, creating an impression of boundless extension. These moments are significant, even if not consciously recognized as such. They challenge the assumption that environments must have edges, and they introduce the idea still unformed that what lies ahead may not be another landform, but a continuous system without clear termination. Still, life continues in practical terms. The group exploits resources, follows seasonal movements, and adjusts to environmental cycles. Over time, they become increasingly specialized in coastal subsistence, knowledge of tides, fish behavior, shellfish locations, and bird migration patterns deepens through repeated experience. This does not happen as a single cultural shift. It happens through accumulated necessity. Each generation inherits not a map, but a set of adaptive strategies tied to a world that is always in motion. Meanwhile, the inland identity slowly recedes, not disappearing but becoming less central. The coast is no longer a frontier. It is becoming a home environment, even if it is not fully understood, even if its underlying structure remains partially invisible. And beyond this zone of adaptation, the system that shapes it continues outward, expanding in ways that are still not fully accessible to perception. The group is now living at the edge of a vast continuum, one that no longer resembles the inland world they came from, and one that is still unfolding in directions they can feel, but not yet fully comprehend. Memory begins to behave differently when the world around it refuses to stay still. For the group now living along these expanding coastal systems, recollection is no longer anchored to fixed landscapes. Inland memory once depended on stable reference points, a forest ridge, a river bend, a familiar clearing. These markers allowed experiences to be placed in relation to something unchanging. But here, even the land that was present yesterday may be altered or partially erased today. Water redraws everything. As a result, memory becomes less about exact location and more about patterns of change. Instead of remembering where something is, individuals remember when it appears, under what conditions it becomes accessible, and how it shifts over time. Knowledge becomes temporal rather than spatial. This shift is subtle but profound. It means that experience is no longer stored as a static map, but as a living sequence of environmental states. Within this evolving cognitive framework, stories begin to take shape. Not formal narratives at first, but repeated observations shared across generations where abundant fish gather during certain cycles, when shellfish beds become exposed, how shorelines change after strong storms. These shared understandings gradually form the foundation of oral continuity, and within that continuity, something else begins to emerge. A collective memory of the edge, not a clearly defined place, but an experiential threshold where land stops behaving like land and water begins to behave like something without clear limit. This memory is reinforced each time groups move through transitional zones and encounter the same patterns of instability, abundance, and shifting boundaries. Over time, this becomes a defining feature of identity, even if it is not yet understood as a concept of ocean. The sound that has accompanied them throughout this entire journey now occupies a deeper role in perception. It is no longer simply part of the environment, it has become a marker of place itself. Its variations signal proximity to open water, changes in weather systems, and shifts in coastal dynamics. In some regions, it grows stronger and more layered. In others, it recedes slightly, replaced by quieter zones where land offers more resistance and structure. But it is always present, always continuing. This constancy, combined with environmental instability, creates a paradoxical experience, a world that is always changing, yet always accompanied by the same underlying presence. The coastline itself continues to evolve. In some areas, it becomes sharply defined, where land meets open water in more direct transitions. In others, it dissolves into complex networks of channels, islands, and tidal flats that stretch far inland and outward simultaneously. These variations make it difficult to define a single edge. Instead, there are many edges, all shifting, all temporary. Resource abundance remains a central factor in sustaining human presence here. Coastal zones provide reliable access to protein-rich food sources, seasonal plant materials, and navigable waterways that connect distant regions. Over time, this encourages longer stays and more stable patterns of settlement in certain areas. But stability here is different from inland stability. It is conditional, dependent on cycles that extend beyond immediate control. Tides, storms, seasonal migrations, and sediment shifts all influence where life can be sustained. Communities learn to move with these cycles rather than resist them. This creates a new form of environmental literacy, one based on anticipation rather than control, observation rather than dominance. Meanwhile, shell accumulations continue to expand in both frequency and distribution. In some areas, they form dense layers within sediment, indicating long-term biological and environmental accumulation. These layers will, in much later time, become part of the geological record that reveals the extent of ancient coastal ecosystems. But for now, they are simply part of the landscape. Persistent, recurrent, unexplained in full, the group continues to move through regions where land and water are no longer separate categories but overlapping conditions. Some areas remain semi-stable for extended periods, allowing temporary occupation. Others shift too rapidly to support long-term presence. And yet, even in instability, continuity exists, because the system itself is continuous, not fragmented, not isolated, but part of a much larger structure that extends far beyond immediate perception. Occasionally, the group reaches elevated ground where the view extends outward across vast open water. In these moments, the horizon appears endless, merging with sky in ways that defy inland experience. There is no visible termination, only expansion. These moments are not fully interpreted, but they accumulate in memory, and over time they begin to form the basis of an implicit understanding that what lies beyond the shoreline is not another environment of familiar type. It is something without clear boundary, something continuous, something vast enough that it cannot be contained within inland categories of place. The ocean is not yet named, but it is already present in every experience. In sound, in movement, in memory, and in the slow transformation of how humans understand the world they inhabit, there comes a point where even uncertainty becomes familiar. For the group moving along this shifting coastal world, the landscape no longer produces surprise in the way it once did, not because it has become predictable, but because adaptation has reached a level where variability itself is expected. Land will change, water will shift, paths will appear and disappear. Nothing remains fixed long enough to be relied upon absolutely. And so the mind stops searching for permanence. It begins to search for rhythm instead. The shoreline, in its full expression, is no longer experienced as a boundary between two worlds. It is experienced as a zone of continuous exchange, where land is gradually dissolved into water and water is constantly reshaped by land. Even the idea of separation loses clarity here. Everything is in transition. Everything is in motion. Everything participates in a larger system that refuses simplification. The sound remains present. Always? It no longer draws attention as something unusual. Instead, it has become part of the fabric of perception itself. It marks space in a way that vision cannot. It fills silence in a way that inland environments never required. It gives continuity to a world that otherwise offers none. In moments of stillness, when wind drops and movement slows, the sound becomes the only constant reference point, not as information, but as presence. By now, the group's relationship with the environment is no longer defined by exploration alone. It is defined by integration. They are not simply passing through coastal systems. They are living within them, responding to their cycles, shaping their movements in response to tides, storms, and seasonal changes that extend beyond immediate perception. Over time, this produces a deep familiarity with patterns that were once incomprehensible. The rise and fall of water becomes expected. The movement of fish becomes readable. The shifting of shorelines becomes something that can be anticipated with experience rather than guessed at through uncertainty. And yet, despite this growing familiarity, the larger structure of the world remains partially hidden. Because what they are interacting with is not just a coastline. It is the edge of a vast planetary system of water and movement that extends far beyond visible reach. The ocean, though never fully conceptualized in these early stages, is already shaping every aspect of life here. It determines resource distribution, influences migration, regulates climate interactions, and defines the limits of land itself. It is not a destination reached in a single moment of arrival. It is a presence that reveals itself gradually through accumulation of experience. In this way, the first human encounter with the ocean is not a singular event. It is a slow realization, built from fragments, shells in unexpected places, water that refuses to stay contained, horizons that dissolve into distance, sounds that never cease, and landscapes that constantly reorganize themselves. Each fragment alone is incomplete. Together, they form an emerging understanding of something vast. As time continues, oral memory begins to preserve these experiences in increasingly structured ways, not as precise geographic records, but as narratives of transition, stories of land that ends without ending, of water that connects everything it touches, of environments that cannot be fully held in a single mental image. These are not yet myths in the formal sense. They are memory under formation, and within them, the ocean exists even before it is named. As the group remains along these ever-changing coastal systems, one final transformation becomes clear. The world no longer has an edge in the way inland environments once suggested. Instead, it has continuity, a continuous expanse where land meets water without definitive separation, where movement replaces stillness as the primary condition of existence, and where understanding depends not on fixed points, but on ongoing adaptation. Looking outward from these shores, there is no final boundary to be seen. Only expansion, only horizon merging with sky, only the vast unresolved presence of water extending beyond perception. And in that presence, humanity encounters something that will define all future navigation, survival, and imagination, not as a moment of discovery, but as an unfolding realization that the world is larger, more continuous, and more connected than anything that came before it. The ocean is no longer an unknown. It is the background of everything they have become, and as the last light fades across the shifting water, the sound continues without end, carrying forward into a world that still has no final edge.